Okay. And so they're connected. You can hear me?
Yeah, it's going to be on your line.
Okay. 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 Sorry to interrupt everybody's lunch, but we're going to start our quick presentation before moving into our discussion. And thank you all for coming today, and especially thank you to our guests. If you've been watching the last 3 primary debates, you'll probably have noticed that foreign policy questions were asked more than any other topic. And depending on which survey you look at, foreign policy comes in at either first or second for the issues that voters are most interested in for the upcoming elections. So foreign policy is bound to be on the agenda for the 2015 campaigns and 2016 election. And so we're delighted to share our results with you based on how the different partisans divide on key foreign policy issues. The survey was conducted between May 25th and June 17th. That is before the Iran agreement was signed, before Russia invaded Syria, but in general, many of the big issues that we're dealing with today were still in play at that time. And basically, the big takeaway themes are that both Republicans and Democrats and independents support engagement in world affairs, a little less so for independents, you'll see. They agree on what the top threats and goals should be, including terrorism as the top threat, and they agree on the actions that we should take against terrorism. But beyond that, there are some really specific divides, especially on immigration and climate change, on the Iran deal, on the role of Israel in the Middle East today, and on the creation of an independent Palestinian state. So this is our hallmark barometer of American support for staying engaged in the world, or whether people think we should stay out of world affairs. And you'll see 64% now say that the United States should take an active part in world affairs. And this has actually increased from last year. It was 58%, now it went up to 64%. And looking at all of the other issues, seems that that's pretty much related to an increase in fears about terrorism. And also, we didn't ask about it in our survey, but it could be because of relaxing anxiety about the American economy. And then what's been interesting, if you look over time, because that's really the value of the Chicago Council survey, is that we've been conducting this for over 40 years. Since 1982, the red line, which are Republicans, have generally been much more likely to say that we should take an active role in world affairs than Democrats, which is the blue line. But since 2008, 2010, Democrats are as likely as Republicans to support taking an active role. On the other hand, there's been a continuing downward trend among independents. And when we talk about independents, we asked independents first, do you consider yourself a Democrat, or Republican, or an independent? If they said independent, we then said, do you lean more closely to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party? And if they said neither, which just over half say neither, then we consider them true independents. And actually, among that group, only 50% support US engagement in world affairs. So as I said, there's mostly agreement on what the top critical threats are, especially the top 4. And most of them relate to terrorism, the possibility of violent Islamic extremist groups carrying out an attack in the United States, international terrorism, and then 4th on that list is rise of violent Islamic extremist groups in Iraq and Syria. And cyber attacks is also a very critical threat according to Americans of all political stripes. So when we break it down by Democrats, independents, and Republicans, there's just a couple places where immediately some differences pop up. The first is on climate change. If you look at the blue column, the 5th most critical threat for Democrats is climate change. This is the 20th most critical threat for Republicans, which is actually the lowest ranking they can give to climate change or any of the threats. And among Republicans, Fourth is Iran's nuclear program. This is also a concern for Democrats. It's just not as emphatic a concern. And when you look at goals, there's another difference with Republicans, which is on immigration. So the top 3 foreign policy goals across the board are protecting American jobs, preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, and combating international terrorism. So beyond that, if you look at the Republican side, the red column, maintaining superior military power worldwide is a much more important goal to Republicans than Democrats, though Democrats do value military superiority and in certain cases will support the use of force. But in general, Democrats' default inclination is to rely on diplomatic efforts like alliances and treaties and trade agreements to achieve our foreign policy goals. So on the other hand, Democrats are more likely to say that securing adequate supplies of energy and improving access to clean water are very important goals, and independents have something in common with both. They say the 4th most important goal would be securing adequate supplies of energy, and the 5th is controlling and reducing illegal immigration, which is one of the top issues for Republicans. And you can see in this graph that there is a very big divide between Republicans and Democrats on whether immigration is a critical threat to the United States and whether limiting illegal immigration is a very important goal. It hasn't always been the case. If you look early on until 2002, Democrats, independents, and Republicans pretty much felt the same way. So this is actually a trend that has occurred over time. And the same, this is actually, climate change is the widest of all the issues, of all the partisan differences. And 6 in 10 Democrats think that climate change is a critical threat compared to fewer than 2 in 10 Republicans. And then there's an interesting curve in the blue line, and that's because Gallup has done a lot of polling on this, comparing trade-offs of environmental protection and economic growth. And during times of economic difficulties, like in 2008, 2010, Americans are less likely to emphasize the environment. And then on the Iran deal, at this point, these data, we found 6 in 10 supported the deal, but this was before the deal was signed. Since then, there's been a lot more discussion and debate about it, and recent polls show that support has actually softened. But the key takeaway is that Democrats consistently, across all the polls, are consistently more supportive of the Iran deal than Republicans and independents. And Republicans, as I said before, are more likely to support the use of force. And in this case, if Iran were to violate a deal, then Republicans are more likely than other partisans to support sending US troops to destroy Iranian nuclear facilities. And then one of the really interesting findings that came out of this survey was on Israel. You can't really talk about the Iran deal without also linking attitudes towards Israel and the security of Israel. And Democrats are more likely than Republicans to say that Israel actually plays a negative role in resolving the key problems facing the Middle East. And Republicans are more likely to say that Israel plays a positive role, and independents are in between. And we think this might be partially because it's related to the lack of progress to a political settlement, to the differences between Palestinians and Israelis. It also could be related to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and his visit, and we can talk about that. But the main shift has been among Democrats. Overall, the American public is divided on whether they support or oppose an independent Palestinian state. But Democrats, since 2002, have grown more positive, where the other partisans have remained pretty much on the same level of being divided. And finally, the area of consensus is on terrorism. The big shift is that 55% of Americans, if you look at the second line, now think that Islamic fundamentalism is a critical threat, and that's up 15 points from 2014, and nearly as high as it was after the September 11th attacks. But if you look at the attitudes towards international terrorism being a critical threat, 7 and 10, it's up a couple points from last year, but it's not nearly as high as it was in the years immediately following September 11th. And finally, this graph just shows that there is a lot of support for a wide range of actions against terrorist training camps and facilities, and using drones, especially using low-cost, low-risk means like drones and airstrikes and assassinations. But even sending in U.S. ground troops is supported by majorities across the board. So finally, just to recap, Americans do share a desire for staying involved in the world. Republicans and Democrats have common fears. And it's interesting now, if you listen to the primary debates and you hear the candidates' positions, especially on the Republican side, on their differences on how they would deal with immigration and Iran to some extent, that really emphasizes that the candidates are appealing to a particular slice of the electorate right now, but it will be really interesting, especially to hear from our panelists, how candidates will have to adjust then to the views of the median voter once we hit the national election in 2016. So with that, I'd like my standing ovation from our from our staff, from our guests, and to join me for our discussion.
How's that? They wrote it big enough so we can.
So I will start the questioning with David. And ask you, what do you think about this idea that this will be a foreign policy, international security related election? Do you agree?
I think foreign policy is going to be a dimension of it. It's going to necessarily be that, in part because the very likely nominee of the Democratic Party is going to be the former Secretary of State. So foreign policy is going to be front and center in that regard. I think that, and it's reflected in people's concern, that the protection of American jobs going to the top. In my view, there is a fundamental issue that courses through our politics that is not about foreign policy, although impacted by it, which is the stagnancy of wages and incomes. And I think that's going to be a dominant issue in this election. But certainly foreign policy will be important. And let me just emphasize one thing that I've learned through hard experience, which is, for sure, something is going to be an issue in this election that none of us on this panel know right now, and nobody in this audience knows, because you are the prisoner of events in presidential campaigns. We didn't know, for example, 17 months out that Lehman Brothers was going to collapse, or I guess we're 13 now. Lehman Brothers was going to collapse when it did, and that sort of defined. In fact, the foreign policy debate in 2008 was split into two so we could talk about the financial crisis. So I think that foreign policy will be an element of this election. I think there'll be an attempt to prosecute the president's foreign policy as a means of getting at Secretary Clinton. There are legitimate concerns about what's going on, particularly in the Middle East. But ultimately, I think the economy is still going to be the determinant issue in this campaign.
Alex, does foreign policy play a different role on the Republican side versus the Democrat side, or do you think they're basically discussing the same issues?
Maybe viewed through a little different prism first. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with all of you guys.
Oh yeah, like he said.
Yeah, like he said. And I get to litigate my biggest foreign policy grievance with David. Why do you open up Cuba and not get us the cigars?
We'll speak
As a
privately.
Cuban, we'll talk later.
We'll speak privately after.
We'll
the-
talk later, but it's great to be here, a place where you actually think substance ought to have a place in our political debate, and that's a nice thing to see. The place of foreign policy in this election, especially with Republicans, I think everything David said applies on the Republican side, and some other things too. You know, this is an election where the world seems to be coming apart everywhere. Some of it real and some of it only perceived. Certainly our economy at home, we're seeing a change from an industrial economy to a communications economy. Old institutions are dying, jobs are getting shorter. You know, tremendously disruptive change. Guess what? It's happening at the global level as well. And so this is an election that to some degree is something even about bigger than foreign policy, and that is holding the world together, holding our world together at home and abroad, and who has the strength to do that. So when you're talking about an election that's about strength, foreign policy is a great way to understand it. But also the world's connected in ways we never imagined. I mean, we're communicated with and to constantly, and we're plugged into events that happen across the world, happen in our hands in an instant. So, you know, there was a battle between oceans that used to divide and protect us, and the cell phone won. And so now we're no longer isolated like that, and therefore I think that's another reason that foreign policy is much more important.
Ivo, how would you expect foreign policy to differ moving from primaries to, or the discussions of foreign policy among the candidates to differ moving from primaries onto the general election?
Well, I don't know whether it's going to differ very much, to be honest. I think the world that Alex described, this chaos and complexity, I think the dominant Republican theory, at least among the candidates, is that it's Obama and Clinton's fault, that they are weak, they're demonstrating an American weakness, and if we were to demonstrate American strength, things would be better. Russia would not have invaded Ukraine, Russia wouldn't have sent its troops into Syria, and a lot of other things that are occurring are, the critique is, are occurring because America is not as strong as it used to be and should be. I think that's the dominant critique that unites the Republican candidates, and frankly, it is reflected in the survey, which demonstrates that their electorate believes the same thing. So they are speaking the same language. As David says, because the likely candidate on the Democratic side is the former Secretary of State who bears responsibility for the indictment by the Republicans, I think the same kind of language that we see being used by Republicans in the primaries will carry on to the general election, at least for the Republican candidate. You know, when we started thinking about this poll, we thought there was going to be a debate within the Republican Party between the Rand Paul wing and the sort of John McCain wing. Well, we now know who won, because Rand Paul, we read today in the paper, now needs to focus on his Senate re-election, according to Mr. McConnell, Senator McConnell, rather than on his presidential election, in part because, as I think the poll shows, there is no room for that view within the Republican Party, or at least not enough to win.
I think Rand Paul was a victim of, to some degree, of ISIS.
Yeah.
I mean, there is no Rand Paul wing anymore within the Republican Party, and therefore he's turning his attention to the Senate. One thing I would say is there is a cyclical nature to our politics, and Barack Obama, in many ways, was the perfect candidate to run in 2008 because George Bush was seen as too bombastic, too impulsive. People felt he didn't see the nuance and the gray in particularly in the world, And they wanted someone who would be thoughtful, who would be deliberative, who wouldn't be reactive, and they got one. And that's who they got in Barack Obama. And now there is a counter move. You know, now I would argue that Hillary Clinton may be well positioned to deal with that because she is someone who still stresses that diplomacy should be our first avenue, which I think is embraced certainly by Democrats, also by independents. But she certainly is someone who's demonstrated a willingness to impose force. Now that she has a little more freedom within the Democratic primary, I think she has a little more latitude actually to display both parts of that equation. And she is a strong figure. Alex says it's going to be about strength. You know, that's one of her assets, is she projects that. We saw it for 11 hours yesterday. By the way, I'd recommend, if it is a foreign policy election, maybe I'd stay away from the Benghazi thing.
Well, you know what? I think she had a terrific performance. And by the way, an election about strength and holding the world together is a good one for Hillary Clinton. She's tough. She's strong. I mean, she has endured a lot of ups and downs in her life and political career. We've seen her do it. She handled herself impeccably.
Is there any other?
Substance may matter, though. There actually are some issues about what did she know and when did she know it, and why one thing happened on Sunday talk shows when behind the curtain people were saying, well, it wasn't the video. So there are substantive issues.
I think with another 11 hours, you could get to that.
Well, we certainly have shown a capacity to make Hillary Clinton look good, and I think we did that yesterday. But you know, when you're on the wrong end of an FBI investigation, sometimes not even Republicans can help you. But
Is there any other candidate out there that achieves that could fulfill the commander-in-chief role?
Well, I got one. He's huge. He's huge. He's perfect.
well, that's one reason I think you're seeing Donald Trump on the Republican side, because of his vast foreign policy experience. Actually, one of his quotes is, "I know more about diplomacy than anybody."
He just doesn't
But
practice
why is he, in effect, a foreign policy candidate in the Republican side? Because the Republican Party feels we're losing our country. We're sliding over the edge of a precedence. This election may be our last chance to save the country we know and the dreams it has always held for us. And in that situation, it's an election for the reptilian part of our brains, our most primitive part of our brains, the part that's most concerned about survival, you know, the primal things. It doesn't matter where you stand on issues. If nobody's strong enough to keep you safe, to ensure your survival, and along comes the biggest reptile, in a way, and I think that is Donald Trump. And it doesn't matter where he is on issues, doesn't matter that he's not really a Republican, doesn't matter where he stands on ideology. You know, a candidate who has helped himself in these debates because he has talked about foreign policy, and because, actually two, and demonstrated strength as well. Who are they on the Republican side? Marco Rubio and Carly Fiorina. So there, I think you see Republicans who may have potential to grow as this campaign moves forwards, specifically on foreign policy.
We should point out, though, that it is true that Trump, his appeal transcends any particular issues, but there is one issue that, really two, that galvanized the Republican, at least his portion of the Republican electorate: immigration and trade. He is a nativist on immigration, and he's anti-trade. And he's found an audience in the Republican Party, particularly among non-college educated Republicans who, and men more than women, who feel that sentiment that you express more readily than anyone, because they've been caught in the switches of the changing economy. And he's grabbed those voters, with his very forceful language. Disaster for the Republican Party in the long run. But
And what is that? And what does that mean for the final candidate that comes out of the primaries on immigration? Does that mean that person has to take a very rightward stance, or is there any possibility
Depends.
to moving back?
If it's Donald Trump, we may all have to have comb-overs on the Republican side. It could happen.
hey, careful.
He actually, but what we're seeing right now is that Trump is actually falling behind in Iowa, a less secular place than New Hampshire. So say Carson beats him in Iowa, we go to New Hampshire, hair on fire. Who is then the candidate of the establishment? Well, who demonstrates sufficient strength to do the job, right? If that's the first test of this election, are you as strong as our fears? That's what we're looking for. If a Jeb grows, if a Rubio grows, if a Carly Fiorina goes, it may be one of them. Kasich is kind of in the wrong party right now. He's running as a Democrat, which he's a very nice Democrat. If you're going to be a different kind of Republican, you ought to be a Republican first. And Kasich kind of forgot that. He's just running as I'm different than Republicans. Well, that's a Democrat. So,
what does it mean to be a
but what is-
what would you say are the components of being a Republican first?
being a Republican right now, the components that I think you're seeing is job one is strength. Can you hold the world together? When do you turn to unconventional cancer therapy? When conventional therapies have failed you. More of the same to Washington, incremental change. We know that's not working and it's not big enough for the moment. So somebody, has got to get very big, then ideology will matter, issues will matter. Immigration, 55% of Republicans in your survey said immigrants should stay, the majority. Either they should stay, ollie oxen-free amnesty, either they should stay and pass some minor tests, either they should stay and pass major tests, jump through fiery hoops and give all that, whatever, but they should be allowed to stay. Nevertheless, the Republican frontrunner, with only 30% of the vote, is Trump, a fella who's, it's not about the issues, as he's saying, I'm gonna lock the doors at night, keep this country safe, pull the world together. On the one hand, you have Putin, who have we got over here?
I'm glad you brought up that 55% of Republicans support some kind of legal status, but what we found in our poll, and this was really interesting, there are more differences among Republicans than Democrats within the group. So, for example, people who consider themselves moderate Republicans or weak Republicans are divided on whether illegal immigrants should be able to stay in the country, but those who consider themselves strong Republicans are more likely to support deportation. But among independents, those who consider themselves leaning closer to the Republican Party are more like strong, hardline Republicans. So that actually adds even more fuel to the fire of that debate.
The truth is that I'd make a couple of points. One is that the Republican Party is going through something of a civil war, and you've seen it play out in the Congress as well between anti-government populists and governing conservatives. And that's the war that's really being fought out that's the war that Alex outlined, who among the governing conservatives is likely to emerge to challenge the anti-government populists. And the category is the people who he named. It's a question of when and how that happens. New Hampshire is probably the first big test, but this is a serious fight. I mean, Paul Ryan actually, I think it seems like he skillfully maneuvered this. We'll see how it holds.
They wanted him to coach the team, but they wouldn't let him run the team or call any plays.
But I mean, it's my sense that he dictated the terms of his acceptance.
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens in practice.
If you want me to lead, you got to let me. Doesn't seem entirely unreasonable, but at times it is in our party. So
Yeah. So they've got in the Democratic Party right now, by a 2-to-1 margin, Democrats say they have favorable ratings of their leaders. In the Republican Party, it's the opposite. It's 30-60. And part of it is because Republicans, anytime Congress cooperates with the president, it's a source of frustration to base Republicans.
I would argue there's perhaps another interpretation. This is why I enjoy these things. He's relentlessly, remarkably wrong about everything. If he weren't such a good human being and a great friend, I wouldn't love him as much. But there's another argument to that, and that is, yes, there's a civil war in the Republican Party, but guess what? There isn't one in the Democratic Party. You're right. Bernie Sanders is the other socialist running for president. Hillary Clinton is the one who stood up on the stage and the other stages and says businesses don't create jobs. She's the one who half-heartedly found it embarrassing to defend capitalism. Beneath this unity on the Democratic side, there's a party that has moved substantially left. Yes, David, I think is exactly right. George Bush, cowboy, got us into war, scared us. So what do? We overreact like we always do, push the pendulum way left toward soft power internationally, toward multilateral dialogue instead of the clarity at times of unilateral action. And we have seen that a bit of that retreat from the world has made the world a more dangerous place. American foreign policy is based on alliances, and it's based on deterrence. And when you look around the world now, you know, our alliances seem to be getting weaker. We can say that certainly in the Middle East, and the other guys' alliances seem to be getting stronger, Russia, Iran, and Syria. And we have deterrence is kind of based on the idea that you won't cross those lines.
There's pretty
so
strong
I think there is
Actually,
a Democratic foreign policy is a good place to talk about this election, because I think it's also one perspective of it, not necessarily the right one, but mine, is that you can see a Democratic Party that, especially in foreign policy, is being pushed left and left on that side.
I know that Ivo has a lot of views on the issue of deterrence, and so I'd like to hear from him. And also, for all of you, you saw from the polling data, and everybody's concerned about ISIS and related groups, and there's really unified support for taking almost any kind of action. Does this mean that inevitably we're heading toward an administration that's going to have a more muscular approach, particularly to terrorism, but in general? So we'll hear from Ivo, and then whatever anyone else wants to add.
Well, I think, as both David and Alex said, I mean, there's a cyclical pattern in American foreign policy, and it's a great book by Stephen Sestanovich about maximalist and minimalist foreign policy, and you go through these cycles. So we're definitely on a more maximalist cycle after a more minimalist cycle. As the foreign policy analyst, as opposed to, and to some extent practitioner, as opposed to the political strategist.
In other words, there's someone who knows something.
Well, no. I do worry.
Actually, yes.
Okay, yes. I do worry that the solutions that are being put forward for political reasons or sentiment reasons may not actually be effective. And I think the issue that the president faces is that I think analytically he's probably right about the nature of power and the nature of American power and how it can be used and how effective it can be in certain circumstances. I think we've gone through the greatest social science experiment in interventionism ever, right? We have invaded a country and occupied it, and it's a mess. It's called Iraq. We have invaded a country and not occupied it, and it's a mess. It's called Libya. And we have not invaded a country and not occupied it, and it's a mess, and it's called Syria. So the independent variable here doesn't seem to be intervention, which is to say what is happening inside these countries is more determinative than the strength that the United States projects into those conflicts. That's an analytical judgment. How you then translate that into policy terms, and how do you translate it into how the policy is perceived is a challenge. The reality is, it seems to me, that intervening in Syria would not have fundamentally changed the nature of the course of this conflict, and yet not intervening has had consequences in terms of public perception, in terms of perceptions of the players on the ground, including by the Russians, that undermine your capacity to deter in other circumstances.
The question is
But the issue-
what impact intervening has in terms of exacerbating the situation on the ground in terms of radicalization and recruitment. And I think there's a real fundamental question there as to the wisdom. I mean, it's satisfying to think that Americans can go in, and we have by far the strongest army on the planet, that we can go in and just crush ISIS. But the question is, what next?
But I think the question that many Republicans have is, intervening may have been a terrible answer. Not intervening may have been even worse. But promising to intervene on certain conditions and not is worst of all. And I think what Republicans are seeing, that the idea that somehow America must step back from its role in the world, that a new realpolitik requires that America is just one among many nations that must lead. I think Republican concern is that American leadership in that sense is not a luxury we can discard, that it turns out it's the glue that holds the civilized world together, that Europe and the EU do better when America is engaged, that, and that doesn't necessarily always mean military power, but this idea that somehow there's a moral equivalence of our system with others and that we are just one among many, that it has led us to a more complex world.
That's kind of a loose characterization of what the
I'm
president's
saying
view and policy is.
I'm trying to be generous here and say this is what Republicans see and what I think is activating and motivating certainly the Republican electorate.
Yeah,
in this
I
election.
certainly believe that. Although the visual representation for a lot of Republicans about the projection of American leadership often winnows down to the use of military force. And you know, there is a broader consensus, it seems to me, in this poll for multilateralism, where the U.S. leads and brings countries together to solve some of these questions. I think that one of the lessons, and I know this is a polling discussion, but you know, one of the lessons we should have learned over the last 14 years is, and Ivo hints at it, which is what are, you know, where is some sense of humility actually warranted in terms of what American power can and can't do? Can we go in, occupy a country that doesn't have a history of democracy and has a long tribal history, and override all of that history and impose what we feel is the appropriate system? And we've tried that, and it's been, you know, it's why we are in the mess we're in. So we should at least be willing to learn those lessons as we move forward.
Okay, so I actually have to cut. This has been fascinating, great discussion, but I have to cut to get questions from the audience. So if you could raise your hand, please, and then wait for the microphone to come. So Phil Levy on the front.
Well, thank you very much. A very interesting discussion. I have a question for Mr. Axelrod. One of the polling results, which Dina just didn't have the time to include, showed fairly strong support for international trade and trade agreements, actually even stronger among Democrats than among Republicans.
Yeah.
One of the truly brilliant political moves, I think, in 2008 was that when there was a split within the Democratic Party and you had some very skeptical of trade and some eagerly supportive, then Senator Obama convinced both groups that he was firmly with them. Now, Secretary Clinton has taken a different approach and opposed the president's Trans-Pacific Partnership. Do you think that's a wise political move?
Well, I think there are a few aspects to that. I think it was a risky move on her part because of the suspicion that her sometimes some of her principles are fungible, and this is an example of that. So from the trust dimension, it was a risk. Within the Democratic Party, probably not so much. I think she took the position in part because at that time she was anticipating the potential candidacy of the vice president, who was very much tied to the president's policy. That gave her an advantage with Labor and some other groups. But I will say this, the way she expressed her opposition was certainly left the door open to the future. I don't believe necessarily that the TPP is going to pass this Congress, and it may be like other agreements, and it may slop over into the next, slop is a bad word, but it may bleed over into the next administration. And I wouldn't be surprised if with some changes that she, because she did not take a hard anti-trade position in opposing that. One last point on this. It used to be that there was a strong consensus among the Republican Party in favor of trade. That's no longer the case. And it's, you know, so we have anti-trade factions in both parties that are making it more difficult for these agreements to be, and one of the disputes I think that Speaker Boehner had with some of his base was they were unhappy that he passed the fast track, and partly because a core of them didn't believe in trade, and partly, and the rest of them who were against it didn't want to hand the president a victory. So it's, but I think she has threaded the needle to the point where, as Obama did in 2008 when he said he would enhance NAFTA, you know, I think she's following that same path.
Okay, we had a question in the back. The woman with her hand up with the scarf. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Orla MacBreen, the new Consul General from Ireland, and thank you for a very interesting discussion. I think the description of a complex and globalized world where foreign policy is no longer the exclusive responsibility of the government, and there are a lot of actors, is something we recognize in Europe. And in that context, when you talk about strength, as a lot of people on the panel have done, to what degree do you think the perception of strength is that your strength is increased in international action when you have partners and alliances that you work well with, for example, the EU and other European partners, or when there are rising competitors such as China, where you may or may not have similar views? I wonder if the panel could speak to that. Thank you.
They're all looking to me. I don't know why. Maybe because of the European piece. I think there's a widespread agreement among Democrats and Republicans that having strong partners alongside the United States is a good thing. It enhances our strength. I think Democrats in our poll show that they are a little bit more inclined to put alliances first. Would be part of being part of an alliance and having strong partners is to actually listen to them and spend some time thinking about what it is that they want to do in order to come up with a stronger, united policy. Sometimes that is a little messy, and it doesn't look as clean as it would be by saying, here is what I'm going to do, and please follow me, and then looking back and finding that nobody is in fact following you. So that's the challenge for alliances and alliance management, particularly when you are, like the United States, a leader of that alliance. But I think in general, the idea that partners are part and parcel of your strength, and that is in fact one of the great strengths that the United States has, that it has partners and allies around the world, is something all Americans would agree with.
Ivo, do you think that that our alliances are weaker today than they were 8 years ago?
Well, they were certainly stronger in 2013 than they were in 2009. But no, I actually think our alliances are stronger. In our traditional alliances, both in Europe and in Asia. I was just in Asia earlier this week. There is in NATO and in the Asia side, there is very little doubt. There's no more doubt about America's commitment to their security than there has been traditionally. And the reason is simple. It's because Russia has behaved in a way that makes the alliance more united than it was in the past. And China is posing a threat, particularly in the eyes of Japan, that makes reliance on the United States more important. It also, though, means that the United States has an obligation to be more engaged both in Asia and in Europe, and I think it has been for some time because the Middle East is such a dominant part of our foreign policy.
A slightly different perspective on that, though that I think that is right in a lot of ways, which is, yes, you see stronger alliances on the Western side than you've seen, but not because we're stronger and more successful. Perhaps it's because we're not. Certainly NATO, there are questions whether it is dissolving and as strong as it used to be as we look at it growing and representing as common an interest. The NATO, the budgets of NATO countries, the defense budgets, all of them have cut their defense budgets. It would be like the equivalent of taking the German defense budget out of NATO. So I think there are questions about its effectiveness. When you look at, it's not just an attempt that matters, but the results. And in terms of the effectiveness of American alliances, I think we have become a less reliable partner in a lot of ways. I've been to more than one dinner as part of the Washington establishment now, more than one dinner in Washington where you talk to an ambassador who says, look, be for something. We don't care what it is, but just stick to it. And some of that, it sounds like a critique of the administration, but it's not that I don't think would be entirely fair. It is a very complex world out there. There are metastasizing threats. We used to live in a world where threats were bipolar and simple, and now we're talking about our biggest threats are cybersecurity and somebody bricking up our economy, and our biggest threats are ISIS, metastasizing interstitial political forces. So yes, it is an increasingly complex world. I think to some degree we're still trying to govern them, with 19th century institutions. And that's something that I think will be the big challenge. But what do people do when they're scared? Like Americans are scared now. Well, they do scary things in response. And yes, I think there are a lot of men, especially in America's economy, who seem to have lost their value. And they get angry. And so what do? They blame them. It's not my fault. It's them, the foreigners. It's those people. It's China. It's them. And that's where we are. How do you resolve that?
It's not just in the American economy. I mean, you
It's
talk about
everywhere.
Europe, and
It's
you
everywhere.
see it all across Europe. You see these
Corbyn,
nativist, nationalist parties showing more strength because mature economies are all dealing with some of the same convulsive changes that technology and globalization have brought. And if we don't cope with those, we're going to
So how do you
continue to
resolve
have.
that?
Well, I think this is why, and not to in any way belittle the importance of foreign policy, but to me, this is why this has to be the central challenge that should be discussed in this campaign. This is not it shouldn't be a partisan issue. The forces that are buffeting our economies have been in the making for decades. Through Republican administrations and Democratic administrations. We are a country that predicates ourselves on the premise that we value work, and if you work hard, you can get ahead. And that is increasingly not true for large numbers of Americans. And that creates the environment for the sort of political disruption that you're talking about. And I think other countries are dealing with it as well. I think we need some really, really intense thinking about how we cope with those forces, because what people see is that we talk about it every election, but their circumstances don't change, and therefore they're losing faith in the political system as a positive source of support on these questions. So I think we've got some really big challenges, and I just hope they don't get shunted off to the side as we get into the usual exchange of, poll-driven drivel.
Nah.
Okay, next question, Andy.
Never.
The most confusing numbers were the independents. And going to Ivo's point about maximalists or minimalists, independents seem to be way to the left of both Republicans and Democrats. So one, to Dina, any explanation for that? To Ivo, how do we construct a worldview if you're a presidential candidate? Because you're not going to be president unless you're getting independence. And how does each party see? I mean, are we looking at, do you look at independence and say, okay, on Iran, on climate, it's a jumbled worldview, issue by issue, rather than a general worldview?
So I'll just quickly say that actually 44% of independents split off and actually identify secretly as partisans of the other parties, and they tend to vote that way as well. And then the small, like 53% of the independents who are pure independents actually are very disengaged from politics. They're not interested in following news about foreign policy in particular. They're less likely to register to vote and to vote. And you two who've worked on campaigns must have studied independents quite a bit and have something to say.
There are a lot of days we want to shoot the independents because they seem to be, I mean, this is about as polarized an environment as you can get, right? Yin and yang. It's pretty clear what both parties are. Republicans pulled right by talk radio. Now Democrats pulled left by the internet. All kinds of things you could say. But in the middle of all this, you've got some independents who are the least engaged. They are the least informed, but at least they care less than other people. And they're going to decide your future. So congratulations on that. How do you lead independents? They're usually not as angry as the extremes on both bases. When your ship is dead in the water and not moving anywhere, and we're running out of supplies, and more for you means less for him, you two guys are not going to be able to litigate that. You're not going to sit down and argue that out. Your answer is to get the ship moving forward. Your answer is promised land. There's something better for us over the horizon. Let's go. That's what David was talking about, I think, when he's saying that economics and that economic optimism is, in a way, the solution to some of the foreign policy dialogue. And it is a way to lead the independents and say, look, Moses didn't say, guys, I got a great idea. Let's go to the desert. It's really hot, but we'll fight the bad guy. No, there's promised land. So which candidate this election not only has the strength to deal with foreign policy issues and an economy that is, devolving in some ways, but which candidate also has the optimism to unite people? There's something better for us. Which candidate is the most connected to the future? I think that's a big challenge for both parties to help with those independents.
I just, before time runs out, two things that I think, and you flagged them, that were disquieting about this survey. One is, of course, climate change. And it's something that's completely consistent with polling that I've seen over a long period of time. People don't respond to those words particularly. We always, there are two things that we always tried to do, which was, first of all, you talk about climate change as pollution and people respond more readily to it. And the second thing is to try and make, green energy an economic plan so that people saw it as an economic plus and not an economic minus, which they tend to. But the thing about this particular problem is that it has vast, foreign policy implications as well as other implications, and it's irreversible. And I was on a program when the president was making a State of the Union speech, and NBC had just done a poll, and climate change was at the bottom of the list of people's concerns. And I was asked, well, why is the president talking about it? It's at the bottom of the list of concerns. And I was thinking, I just had my grandchild, my first grandchild was just born, and I was thinking, she's going to be alive at the end of this century when the scientists say our planet will be greatly degraded if we don't do anything. And what am I supposed to do? Say to her from the grave, well, we would have done something about it, but the NBC Wall Street Journal poll wasn't good enough?
Well, the interesting thing about that is that most other publics around the world, except for the US and China, see climate change as a really pressing threat. So it's the polluting countries that...
But again, you know, because I think a lot of it, economic concerns trump climate change as a concern. I think there's the overlay, and Alex can speak to it, of, you know, big government solutions to the problem and so on that get the Republicans going in this. The second thing that was disturbing was the numbers on Israel. And, you know, I really regret those. And I feel one thing that's happened over the last few years has been a real partisanization of that issue. You know, I have my views on it, and Alex may have different views on it. I don't think the Prime Minister coming here and speaking to Congress and intervening in that way was helpful, but I think there have been some long-term, you know, there are a number of elements of it, but support for Israel has always been a bipartisan commitment.
We were really just focusing in the report, and especially today, on where the partisan differences are, but actually, if you look at the broader picture, Americans across the political spectrum have positive views of Israel. It's higher among Republicans lately, which might be tied to this particular regime in Israel. But, and then a majority of all Americans support, or at least half, support the United States sending troops if Israel is attacked. And that's in a hypothetical situation, so if it were a real situation that...
Well, I thought those numbers should have been higher, actually.
Well, other than fighting terrorism and maybe military action against Iran if it would violate an agreement, those are actually as high as it gets.
But there's not, as high as it gets, but there's not a lot of enthusiasm for any of, you know.
No,
generally.
because Americans are never enthusiastic about sending troops abroad.
But my basic point, though, is that these partisan divides, I think, are somewhat new.
Yeah.
And
yes.
they're disquieting.
Yes, I
And
agree.
they may be an indication of, again, that bigger picture we've been talking about is how do you make a decision? Say you're buying a watch. You can buy this watch or that watch, a Republican or a Democrat. And you can argue all day long about their virtues and their values, but at the end of the day, neither one of them tells time pretty well. So at this point in life,
watch that
it's
moves
hard
forward.
to. Well, or the watch that pretends to move forward. It's hard to resolve that debate right now on either side. And I'd submit to you that one reason is that the old industrial age model we have for governing things, the VA, those kind of things, it doesn't seem to work very much. Whether in domestic policy, and the answer from the Democrats in Washington seems to be, well, we'll just do more of it, make it bigger. The answer from Republicans seems to be, no, it doesn't work. And right now, that's why I think we see such polarization. And I think it's incumbent on one of us to do something about that, not by going left versus right, but by saying everything else in the world has changed. Everything else is opened up. Everything else is look at the parts of the economy that are working, the parts of the world that are working. What is working? It's certainly not old industrial age models. So it's an ugly time, but a hopeful time, I think, because we are seeing some new things that do work and happen in the economy and other places. Maybe we'll see some of those different models in the world of foreign policy as well.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I would love to get you all together again to discuss another poll at some time.
We get together all the time.
Climate change.
But thank you very much for your
Thank you for having us.
participation, and thank you all for attending.